There is a question that historians have argued about for 80 years, a question that governments have buried, censored, and rewritten, a question that survivors on both sides have carried to their graves without a single public answer. What truly happened when the Red Army reached Berlin? Not the official version, not the triumphal photographs of the Red Banner raised above the Reichstag, not the victory parades, not the monuments. What happened in the streets, in the apartments, in the cellars, in the silence that followed the guns? This is that story. January 1945. The Soviet front lines stretched across the frozen plains of Eastern Europe like a wound that would not close. 2.5 million soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of artillery pieces, tanks, aircraft, and supply trucks. The greatest concentration of military force in human history, and all of it pointed in one direction, west, toward Germany, toward Berlin. But to understand what this army was, you have to understand what it had already survived. These were not fresh recruits filled with abstract patriotism. These were men and women who had spent 4 years walking through the wreckage of everything they had once called home. Think about what they had seen. Minsk, the capital of Belarus, reduced to ash. When Soviet forces liberated Minsk in the summer of 1944, they found that more than 80% of the city's buildings had been destroyed. Of the population that had lived there before the war, barely a fraction remained. Where had the rest gone? Some had fled east, many had been worked to death in labor camps, thousands had simply vanished. Smolensk, Kiev, Kharkov, Stalingrad. Every soldier on that front line had a city burned into his memory, a village, a name, a face that would never return. Sergeant Vasily Grossman, one of the most gifted war correspondents of the Soviet era, traveled with the Red Army from the first days of the German invasion. He witnessed the liberation of Treblinka extermination camp in August 1943. What he wrote in his notebooks, which were only published decades later, was a description of ground that had literally been mixed with human remains. He could not find the words. He tried. The notebook pages filled, and still the reality exceeded language. By January 1945, Soviet forces had liberated dozens of such places, camp after camp. The soldiers who marched through those gates, many of them young men from small towns and collective farms, carried those images into every step they took toward Germany. This is not to excuse what came next. This is to explain the psychology of an army unlike any in modern history. An army that had not simply been sent to fight, an army that believed in its bones that it had been sent to collect a debt. 2 men would lead this army to Berlin's gates, 2 men more different from each other than the winter and the spring. The first was Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. Zhukov was a force of nature compressed into a military uniform. Born into poverty in a small village in the Kaluga region, he had climbed through the Soviet military hierarchy through sheer, relentless will. He was the man who had stopped the German advance at Moscow in 1941, who had orchestrated the destruction of an entire German army at Stalingrad, who had masterminded the colossal tank battle at Kursk in 1943. Every major Soviet victory bore his fingerprints, but Zhukov was not a man who counted the cost. Veterans who served under him described a commander who viewed human lives as units of calculation. A river needed crossing, send men across and see how many make it. A fortification needed breaking. Mass the artillery, accept the casualties, keep moving. He was, in the assessment of British historian Anthony Beevor, a commander of extraordinary strategic genius and remarkable personal cruelty toward his own subordinates. When Zhukov was displeased, and he was often displeased, officers feared him more than they feared the enemy. He had commanders arrested and sent to punishment battalions during battle. He issued orders that were physically impossible to carry out, and then punished those who failed. He drove his army like a machine, and the machine worked. The second man was Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky. Rokossovsky was, in almost every way, Zhukov's opposite. He had spent the years 1937 through 1940 in one of Stalin's prison camps, accused of being a Polish spy, a charge so absurd that even by the standards of the Great Terror, it was difficult to sustain. He had his teeth knocked out during interrogation. He survived only because the military desperately needed experienced officers when Germany invaded. Stalin had him released and returned to command, a man who had been imprisoned, tortured, and nearly killed by his own government. And then sent back to fight for that government, you might expect bitterness or recklessness or both. Instead, Rokossovsky became known as one of the most humane and tactically thoughtful generals in the Soviet military. Veterans recalled that he listened to his officers. He accepted objections. He tried to preserve lives when tactics allowed. When the time came to assign commanders for the Berlin operation, Stalin made his choice. Rokossovsky was moved north, to the Baltic. The Berlin Axis, the most prestigious command in the history of Soviet arms, went to Zhukov. The reason, according to Soviet archival documents that were not declassified until after the collapse of the USSR, was political as much as military. Stalin wanted a marshal he could control completely. Rokossovsky, with his history of imprisonment and his reputation for independent judgment, was a less reliable instrument. Zhukov was ambitious, and ambition, Stalin understood, could always be redirected. But there was another dimension to this decision that historians have only recently begun to explore. By sending Rokossovsky north and Zhukov to Berlin, Stalin was making a choice about what kind of army would enter the German capital, not just tactically, morally. In early February of 1945, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, issued Directive Number 11. It ordered Soviet soldiers to maintain discipline and treat German civilians with restraint. Looting was forbidden. Collective punishment was forbidden. Commanders were responsible for the behavior of their troops. The directive was sent down through the chain of command. It was read aloud to assembled soldiers. Political officers noted it in their reports. And then the army continued its march west, and the reality of those orders met the reality of the road, because the road told a different story. As the Red Army pushed into German territory, first into East Prussia, then through Poland and into Germany proper, soldiers were crossing a landscape that had been organized for war. They passed the ruins of towns that Soviet forces had liberated months earlier, still smelling of smoke. They passed columns of freed Soviet prisoners of war, skeletal figures in rags who could barely walk. They passed concentration camps, work camps, transit camps, the machinery of a system that had processed human beings as raw material. One soldier, Lev Kopelev, a Red Army political officer who would later be imprisoned for writing about what he witnessed, recorded in his diary that the men around him stopped thinking of German civilians as individuals sometime in early February 1945. They became, in the language soldiers used to each other, simply the Germans, a category, a collective noun for everything that had happened over 4 years. Kopelev tried to intervene when soldiers looted houses in the East Prussian town of Allenstein. He was later charged with fraternizing with the enemy and sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp. His story is one of the only first-hand accounts from a Soviet soldier who tried to enforce the Moscow directives on the ground and paid a catastrophic personal price for doing so. The gap between the order from Moscow and the reality in the streets was not merely administrative failure. It was structural. Officers who enforced discipline risked becoming unpopular with men who had survived 4 years of war by relying on each other. Commanders who reported incidents to higher headquarters often found the reports quietly buried. The military bureaucracy had exactly one priority in the spring of 1945: reach Berlin before the Western Allies. Everything else was secondary. March 1945. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. American and British forces were driving east. In the south, American troops were racing toward Munich. Stalin looked at the maps. He understood with the clarity of a man who had spent his life playing strategic games with human lives what was at stake. Berlin was not merely a military objective. Berlin was the prize. Berlin was the symbol. Whoever raised their flag over the Reichstag would define the narrative of the entire war. Who had truly defeated Nazi Germany? Who had paid the highest price? Who deserved the greatest share of the post-war world? In conversations with American generals, Stalin deliberately underplayed Soviet intentions toward Berlin. He suggested it was not a primary objective. He allowed the Americans to believe that Berlin might be left to the Western Allies without a fight. At the same time, he ordered his marshals to be ready to launch the Berlin offensive the moment conditions allowed. The deadline he set, though he never committed it to paper in so many words, was understood by every Soviet officer. Berlin must fall before the 1st of May, before International Workers' Day. The propaganda value of planting the Soviet flag on the ruins of Hitler's capital on the day that celebrated the international working class was exactly the kind of symbolic calculation Stalin relished. Zhukov knew this. Konev, commanding the 1st Ukrainian Front to the south, knew this. Between the two of them there was a rivalry that had been building for years, a competition for glory, for decorations, for Stalin's favor. Rokossovsky, sent to the Baltic, knew it too, though from a distance that was itself a kind of punishment. The army that was about to be unleashed on Berlin was an army carrying 4 years of grief, commanded by men competing for immortality, and operating under orders from Moscow that bore almost no relationship to what was actually about to happen on the ground. The stage was set. The question that would haunt the next 6 decades of historical argument, was not whether the Red Army would reach Berlin. It was what they would do when they got there. More than 8 million Soviet soldiers served on the Eastern Front over the course of the war. Nearly 9 million were killed. An entire generation of men vanished into the space between 1941 and 1945, leaving behind wives, mothers, children, empty villages, and an ocean of silence so vast it would take decades to even name it. These are the people who were about to cross into Germany. They did not come as conquerors in the classical sense. They came as something more complicated than that, something history had not yet produced a word for. They came as survivors. And what a survivor does when he finally reaches the place that took everything from him. That is the story of Berlin, 1945. 3 o'clock in the morning, April 16th, 1945. The Oder River, the last natural barrier before Berlin. On the eastern bank, the largest concentration of Soviet firepower ever assembled for a single operation. On the western bank, the Seelow Heights, a ridge of low hills, muddy, fortified, and waiting. What happened next was supposed to be a masterpiece of military planning. It turned into something else entirely, and what it revealed about the man commanding it and about the operation he was racing toward would echo for generations. Zhukov's plan for breaching the Seelow Heights was, in its conception, bold. Over 140 searchlights, massive industrial beams mounted along the Soviet front line, would activate simultaneously at the moment of the infantry assault. The idea was to blind the German defenders, silhouette their positions, and allow Soviet soldiers to advance across open ground in a blaze of artificial daylight. On paper, it was the kind of innovation that wins battles and earns immortality. In practice, it became one of the most catastrophic tactical miscalculations of the final phase of the war. The moment the searchlights activated, the beam struck the low-lying smoke and dust thrown up by the preceding artillery bombardment, a bombardment so massive it had shaken the ground for 50 kilometers in every direction. Instead of cutting through the darkness to illuminate the German lines, the light reflected back against the smoke and fog, creating a luminous wall that turned the advancing Soviet soldiers into perfect, helpless silhouettes. The German defenders, who had wisely pulled back from the front trenches hours before the Soviet artillery struck, leaving the first line empty, looked down from the heights at a glowing curtain of light with Soviet soldiers moving through it, clearly visible, completely exposed. The slaughter was immediate. Over the following 3 days, the First Belarusian Front suffered casualties that even Soviet military historians decades later struggled to quantify accurately. Conservative estimates put the killed at 30,000 men in the battle for the Heights alone. Some historians working with documents declassified after the Soviet collapse suggest the actual figure was significantly higher. Over 700 Soviet armored vehicles were destroyed. 3 days. 30,000 dead, for a ridge of hills 20 kilometers wide. Zhukov was not at the front watching this happen through binoculars, calm and analytical. He was incandescent with fury. He drove his commanders relentlessly, sending message after message, threatening arrest, demotion, and punishment battalions for anyone who did not advance. Officers who tried to explain the tactical realities were shouted down. The pressure from Zhukov was, in the testimony of multiple surviving staff officers, worse than the pressure from the enemy, because behind Zhukov's fury was something he could not afford to admit. To the south, Ivan Konev's first Ukrainian front had already punched through German defenses on the Nesey River and was advancing rapidly. Konev was moving toward Berlin. Konev was going to get there first. The personal humiliation of being overtaken by his rival on the most important operation in the history of the Red Army was for Zhukov simply unacceptable. He threw in his tank reserves, armor that his own operational plan specified should be held back until the heights were breached and a clean corridor was open. He sent them forward into the chaos, into ground churned by days of artillery fire, into traffic jams that stretched for kilometers along roads that could barely support one lane of vehicles. Tanks collided. Supply columns blocked artillery units. Artillery blocked infantry. The entire eastern approach to Berlin became briefly the largest and most lethal traffic jam in military history. And yet on April 19th, the heights finally fell. The price had been appalling. But Zhukov was moving again. While Zhukov was still hammering at the Seelow heights, Konev had already crossed the Spree River and was angling his armored columns northward toward Berlin. Stalin, watching from Moscow, made a decision that was itself a form of psychological warfare, directed not at the Germans, but at his own generals. He redrew the boundary between the two fronts on the operational map, leaving the line deliberately ambiguous at Berlin's southern edge. What this meant in practical terms was that Konev's forces were now technically permitted to enter Berlin if they reached it first. It was a calculated provocation. Stalin had no intention of letting either marshal forget that his favor was conditional, that glory was a prize to be competed for rather than granted. Konev understood immediately. He ordered his tank commanders to accelerate. Rokossovsky, far to the north, advancing through Pomerania toward the Baltic, received no such invitation. He was winning battles and taking territory. But the prize, Berlin, the Reichstag, the flag on the ruins, had been removed from his reach. The city itself, meanwhile, had been declared a fortress by Hitler. Every building was a potential strong point. Every street was a kill zone. The Wehrmacht troops defending Berlin were a mixture of seasoned SS divisions, regular army units, Hitler Youth battalions, boys as young as 14 armed with anti-tank weapons and told to hold positions to the last, and Volkssturm militia, old men with rifles that dated from the previous war. The Soviets entered the outer districts of Berlin on April 21st. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was something closer to an industrial demolition, building by building, floor by floor, room by room. Soviet doctrine for urban combat had been honed at Stalingrad. Small assault groups, flamethrowers, explosives moving through walls rather than doors. Artillery was used at point-blank range against individual buildings. Tanks drove down streets firing directly into facades. The city was being unmade, and inside this unmade city, something else was happening. It began in the outer districts, the suburban streets, the apartment blocks, the cellars stocked with the accumulated possessions of ordinary lives. As Soviet soldiers moved through buildings, they encountered the material world of a prosperous European capital. Furniture, clothing, food, alcohol, jewelry, clocks, radios, cameras. The watches became a symbol. Veterans, Soviet and German alike, recorded in their memoirs and testimonies the same detail. Soviet soldiers collecting wristwatches, stripping them from walls where they hung as decoration, taking them from drawers, accepting them from trembling civilians who pressed them forward as offerings. Some soldiers wore 3, 4, 5 watches stacked up their forearms. The watch was portable, valuable, incomprehensible in its luxury to men from villages, where a clock was a communal possession shared by an entire family. But the watches were merely the surface. Alcohol was the deeper problem. and it was catastrophic. Berlin's cellars were stocked with wine, schnapps, and beer accumulated over years. As Soviet forces moved through neighborhoods, soldiers discovered these stores. The orders against consuming confiscated alcohol were explicit and repeated. They were also completely ignored. Field reports filed by Soviet officers during the Berlin operation, documents that remained classified for decades, describe entire companies rendered temporarily incapable of combat by discovered alcohol stores. Unit commanders reported to their superiors that men had drunk themselves insensible in the middle of active operations. Some units had to be pulled back from forward positions because they could not function. Zhukov was aware of this. The reports came to him. He issued orders. The orders were acknowledged and filed, and the drinking continued. The looting spread from cellars to apartments to shops to museums. Soviet soldiers shipped home packages, a system officially permitted with weight limits, for trophies that contained everything from silk fabrics to porcelain dinner services. Political officers and senior commanders sent larger quantities through official channels. The line between the soldier with a watch and the general with a rail car of furniture was not a line of moral principle. It was a line of rank. Chapter 4. The Man at the Top of the Pyramid. When Soviet investigators searched Georgy Zhukov's Moscow apartment and his country dacha in January 1948, acting on Stalin's orders, what they found was not the modest home of a Soviet military servant. They found over 4,000 meters of silk, brocade, and velvet. They found 323 animal skins. They found 44 antique carpets removed from German palaces. They found 55 paintings in gilded frames. They found 7 large crates of porcelain and crystal. They found complete sets of furniture for every room of 2 properties. All of it German, none of it Soviet. The investigators noted in their report that there was literally nothing of Soviet manufacture in the house. Not even the books on the shelves, which were German volumes in ornate bindings. Zhukov had not merely looked the other way while his soldiers looted, he had participated at a scale that dwarfed anything his men were capable of. 7 train wagons of furniture, crates of antiques. The man who had commanded the liberation of Eastern Europe had simultaneously been running a private removal operation through the ruins of the civilization he was destroying. This was not unusual among senior Soviet commanders. It was, in fact, the norm. What made Zhukov's case distinctive was its scale, and the political use Stalin would eventually make of it. On April 30th, 1945, 2 Soviet soldiers, Sergeant Mikhail Yegorov and Junior Sergeant Meliton Kantaria, raised the red banner of the Soviet Union over the Reichstag building in Berlin. The photograph taken during the official reenactment the following day, Soviet soldiers holding the flag against the smoke-filled sky, ruins of the German capital spread below them, became one of the most iconic images in the history of the 20th century. It has been reproduced on stamps, monuments, murals, and posters. In Russia, it remains today one of the central symbols of national identity. What the photograph did not show was the full cost of what lay behind it. The battle for Berlin, from the crossing of the Oder on April 16th to the city's surrender on May 2nd, lasted just over 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, the Red Army suffered between 60,000 and 80,000 soldiers killed. Some estimates run significantly higher. Soviet armored vehicles destroyed numbered in the hundreds. The city that fell was not merely defeated, it was physically erased. Entire districts had ceased to exist as recognizable urban environments. Of Berlin's pre-war population of approximately 4 million, around 2 million people had remained in the city as the battle began. They had sheltered in cellars and subway tunnels, listening to the city being torn apart above them. When the fighting ended, they emerged into a landscape that no longer resembled the place they had lived. And the army they emerged into, exhausted, wild-eyed, simultaneously triumphant and traumatized, having lost tens of thousands of their comrades in 16 days, was not in any condition to behave like an occupying force in the orderly sense of the word. Konev's forces reached the southern edges of Berlin on April 25th and linked up with Zhukov's troops to complete the encirclement of the city. The two marshals met. Their official communications were correct and professional. What passed between them privately is not recorded. What is recorded is that Konev, in his post-war memoirs, took careful aim at Zhukov's management of the Seelow Heights operation, describing the casualties as unnecessary, the tactical decisions as driven by personal ambition rather than sound military judgment. Zhukov, in his own memoirs, did not mention Konev's criticisms. He did not need to. He was already shaping the official narrative, because in the Soviet telling of the war, there was only one version of the Battle of Berlin, and in that version the searchlights had been a success, the cost had been justified, the victory had been inevitable, and the men who had died on the Seelow Heights had died as heroes, not as victims of a commander's desperate race against a rival. The Soviet army had taken Berlin. On the streets of that broken city, in those final days of April and the first days of May, the story of what victory actually looked like was already being buried, apartment by apartment, report by report, railcar by railcar. The question was, for how long? Every great victory produces two histories. The first history is written immediately in official dispatches, state newspapers, victory speeches, and bronze monuments. It is clean, it is heroic, it is permanent. The second history is written slowly, in whispers, in locked archives, in the private diaries of people who were there and could not say what they had seen. It surfaces in fragments, a document declassified 50 years later, a memoir published in a country where the author no longer feared punishment, a testimony recorded in a hospital room by a historian racing against time. The Battle of Berlin produced both histories, and the distance between them is one of the most revealing gaps in the entire record of the 20th century. May 2nd, 1945. Berlin surrenders. The news reaches Moscow in the early hours of the morning. By noon, Stalin is ordered a victory salute, over 1,000 artillery guns firing into the Moscow sky. The city erupts. People weep in the streets. After 4 years of catastrophic loss, after the invasion, the retreats, the sieges, the hunger, the incomprehensible death toll that touched nearly every family in the Soviet Union, Berlin has fallen. The moment is real. The grief that preceded it is real. The relief is real. And Stalin, standing in the Kremlin, makes a calculation that is as cold and precise as everything he had ever done. The victory must be absolute. The narrative must be seamless. The image of the Red Army, liberators, avengers of the Soviet people, the force that broke the back of fascism, must not be complicated by anything that had happened in those final weeks. Not the Seelow Heights, not the casualties, not the cellars of Berlin, not the rail cars. The machinery of Soviet information control was the most sophisticated in the world. It had spent decades suppressing truths that were far closer to home than the streets of a foreign capital. Suppressing what had happened in Berlin would be, by comparison, straightforward. Field reports describing looting were reclassified and sealed. Soldiers who spoke about their experiences were quietly reminded that certain subjects were inappropriate for public discussion. The official photographic record of the Berlin operation was curated. Images of Soviet soldiers raising flags, embracing liberated prisoners, distributing bread to civilians, all of these circulated freely. Other photographs, which did exist, were filed in archives that would not open for decades. The victory was real, and the victory was also a construction. Both things were true simultaneously. The Soviet Union was not unique in this. Every nation that had fought in the war shaped its own narrative of what had happened. But the Soviet version was enforced with particular efficiency, because the consequences of contradicting it were not merely social, but potentially fatal. For 2 years after the war, Georgy Zhukov was the most celebrated man in the Soviet Union after Stalin himself. He had commanded the final assault on Berlin. He had accepted the German surrender in the name of the Soviet High Command at Karlshorst on May 8, 1945. He had ridden a white horse at the Victory Parade in Moscow on June 24, 1945. an image that entered Soviet iconography immediately. And Stalin watched all of this with the particular attention he reserved for men who had become dangerously popular. A general who had won a war was a different kind of political problem from a general who had merely served loyally. Zhukov was not merely respected, he was loved. Soviet soldiers who had fought under him carried a personal devotion that went beyond military loyalty. His name meant something in the country in a way that could not be entirely controlled from the Kremlin. In 1946, Stalin moved. Zhukov was demoted from his position as commander-in-chief of Soviet ground forces and sent to command the Odessa Military District, a prestigious title attached to a meaningless posting. Then in 1947, he was demoted further, sent to the Ural Military District. A man who had commanded millions was now overseeing a military backwater. The official reason was the trophy affair. The investigation into Zhukov's dacha and Moscow apartment, which uncovered the thousands of meters of silk, the 44 carpets, the 7 wagon loads of furniture, the hundreds of paintings and art objects removed from Germany, was formally cited as the justification for his demotion, and the charges were true. The looting had happened exactly as described, but the trophy affair was a tool, not a cause. The cause was simpler and older. Stalin did not tolerate men who could conceivably replace him in the public imagination. Zhukov had won the war. That was precisely his crime. Konev, who had also participated extensively in trophy operations, was treated very differently. He remained in favor, continued to hold major commands, and eventually became commander-in-chief of the Warsaw Pact forces in 1955. The difference between Konev and Zhukov was not a matter of what they had taken from Germany. It was a matter of how much of a threat they posed to Stalin personally. Rokossovsky, who had been sent to Poland as Minister of National Defense, an honor that was also, in the specific logic of Stalinist politics, a way of keeping him out of Moscow, spent the post-war years navigating the impossible position of a Soviet marshal serving a foreign government at Soviet direction. He returned to the Soviet Union after Stalin's death and died in 1968, quietly honored, the rougher edges of his reputation carefully smoothed by time. In 1954, an anonymous manuscript began circulating in West Germany. It had been written by a woman, a German journalist who had remained in Berlin through the final weeks of the war and recorded what she had witnessed in a detailed, unflinching diary. She published it under the title, A Woman in Berlin. The book was a document unlike almost anything else produced from the wreckage of the Second World War. It was not written from a safe distance. It was written in real time in a cellar in an occupied apartment as events unfolded around the author. It described the daily reality of Berlin's civilian population during and after the Soviet conquest. The fear, the hunger, the desperation, the moral calculations made under conditions of total powerlessness. In West Germany, the book sold modestly and was treated primarily as a historical curiosity. In the Soviet Union, it was never published. The book did not exist. In East Germany, it was equally absent from any official record. When an updated edition was published in Germany in 2003, the author had died, and the book appeared with her identity finally disclosed. It became an international bestseller, translated into more than 20 languages. It forced a public reckoning in Germany with a chapter of the war's end that had been largely left unexamined in public discourse for nearly 60 years. In Russia, the reaction was complicated. Some historians engaged seriously with the book's historical claims. Others dismissed it as anti-Soviet propaganda, a Western attempt to soil the memory of the victory. The debate it generated illustrated with perfect clarity the fault line that had existed since 1945, not between those who had fought and those who had not, but between those who believed that acknowledging the full truth of what had happened was compatible with honoring the sacrifices of the war, and those who believed that any such acknowledgement was a betrayal. That fault line has not closed. After the Soviet collapse in 1991, Russian state archives began, cautiously and selectively, to release documents from the wartime period. Western historians gained limited access to materials that had been sealed since 1945. German researchers working with both the Russian archives and their own national records began piecing together a more complete account of the Berlin operation. What emerged was not a simple story of heroes and villains. It was something more uncomfortable, a story about what happens to human beings under conditions of extreme, sustained violence and trauma, about how institutional systems create the conditions for atrocity through a combination of ideological permission, command neglect, and the suspension of normal moral accountability, about how victorious nations construct narratives of their own conduct that serve political purposes rather than historical truth. British historian Anthony Beevor's work on the fall of Berlin, published in 2002, drew on newly available Soviet archival materials to produce the most comprehensive account of the campaign yet written. The book was banned in Russia. The Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom formally protested its publication. The official position was that the book was a slander against the veterans of the Great Patriotic War. The book contained documented references to orders, field reports, and investigation records from Soviet military archives, documents that the Russian state itself held in its possession. This is the paradox that sits at the heart of the Berlin story and that has never been resolved. The evidence exists. The Russian state possesses it, and the Russian state has to this day declined to engage with it openly as a matter of official historical record. In the Treptower Park district of Berlin, there stands a monument that may be the most remarkable war memorial in the world. Completed in 1949, it consists of a vast sunken garden flanked by stone sarcophagi, at the far end of which rises a colossal bronze figure of a Soviet soldier, 12 meters tall, holding a rescued German child in one arm and a sword in the other. Beneath the figure's feet lies the shattered swastika of the defeated Reich. 16 Soviet soldiers are buried beneath the monument. The site is maintained by the German government. Every year on May 9th, Victory Day, Russian citizens and Soviet veterans' descendants gather there to lay flowers. The monument was built to tell a specific story: the Soviet liberator, the protector of innocence, the destroyer of fascism. That story's true. The Soviet Union did destroy Nazi Germany. The sacrifice involved was staggering and real and deserves every honor it receives. And in the same city, in the same neighborhoods, near that monument, there are German families who carry a different set of memories. Memories transmitted in whispers only within families for decades, because the political realities of post-war Germany, first divided, then reunified, made public discussion of what had happened almost impossible without being accused of relativizing or diminishing Nazi crimes. Both of these things are true simultaneously. They occupy the same city. They refer to the same weeks in 1945. The question of how to hold them both, the genuine heroism and the genuine horror, the liberation and the destruction, the sacrifice and the crime, is not a question that history has yet answered in a way that satisfies everyone, or perhaps anyone. 80 years have passed since May 1945. The last survivors, Soviet veterans, German civilians, the children who hid in the cellars of Berlin while the city burned above them, are gone or nearly gone. The living links to those weeks are closing one by one in hospitals and care homes across Russia, Germany, and the former Soviet republics. What remains are documents, photographs, memoirs, testimonies, and monuments. And the arguments of historians who will never agree, because the disagreement is not really about the facts. It never was, but about what those facts are allowed to mean. Here's what's not disputed. Approximately 27 million Soviet citizens died in the Second World War. The scale of that loss is beyond comprehension. It shaped every aspect of Soviet and then Russian society for generations, and it continues to shape Russian political culture and national identity today in ways that outside observers frequently misunderstand. Here's also what's not disputed. In the spring of 1945, as that army reached Germany, events occurred that violated every principle of the laws of war and of basic human dignity. Those events were not random or isolated. They were widespread, documented by Soviet officers themselves, known at the highest levels of military command and addressed only belatedly and inadequately. The men who did those things had, many of them, suffered losses that no legal or moral framework was ever designed to process. That is context. It is not exculpation. And the commanders who knew, Zhukov, who looted palaces while his soldiers looted apartments, Stalin, who understood perfectly what was happening and chose to look away until Allied diplomatic pressure made looking away inconvenient, bear a different kind of responsibility. The responsibility of those who had the power to act and chose not to. History does not always produce a verdict. Sometimes it produces only a question repeated across generations, to which every generation must find its own answer. The question is this: can a victory be both real and true and also incomplete? Can a sacrifice be genuine and sacred and also complicated by what was done in its shadow? Can we honor the dead, all of the dead, without choosing which truth we are allowed to speak? Berlin, 1945. The flag is raised. The city is ash. The war is over. And the history has only just begun.